So exciting. Okay, so globalization is a really broad term, and it's been happening so long. It's been happening since the beginning of world civilizations in general. So to talk about what it actually is a little complicated, but basically it is the process by which the world becomes connected to a degree that cultures, economics, trades, all that kind of stuff gets crisscrossed and shared. That's exciting.
Somebody just got some kind of thing.
Okay, so there are 4 types of globalization that we talk about in history. There's the globalization that happens through trades and transactions. And this is when we talk about products being traded, like the Columbian exchange of products between Europe and the Americas. That's part of globalization and trade. There's also capital and investment, and those are 2 different things. Capital investment is different from trade and transaction because one of them deals with products and the other one deals with money. And money and products are not the same thing. We get them confused sometimes, but they really are not the same thing. Currency is not the product it buys. Migration of people, populations moving from one place to another, or even just traveling from one place to another. The ability to visit another place is a product of globalization. And the dissemination of knowledge. When cultures become connected, the things that they have figured out, the technologies they have unraveled, and the things that they've learned also become shared. So those are the 4 places that we see globalization mostly take place. Behave. All right, so in ancient times, the first wave of globalization took place right around the Mediterranean. And we talk about this a little bit in this class. We talk about it a lot more in World Civ I. But the along the Silk Road, and globalization moved in this archaic period. It moved from east to west. So it started in China and moved into the Mediterranean. It moved from east to west. Advancements were made in China, and they were carried across to the Mediterranean. They became part of the Roman Empire. Advancements were made in Persia, like domesticating the horse was something that happened in Persia, and it moved west into the Mediterranean and became part of the Roman Empire, which then meant that it was spread across, a larger area. So this is what we call archaic globalization, but it's also a time period in which we thought of the whole world as the Mediterranean. When we talk about the whole world being flooded, we might just be talking about this part of the world right here. So the first wave of globalization that we consider we call archaic. The second wave we call proto-globalization. And this is a period between like 1600 and 1800 when European countries were on purpose, in order to achieve something, actually going to other places and trying to spread their culture and bring culture back. This is willful connectedness. So we see it in the biggest way with the East India Trading Company, the Dutch East India Company, which was, and the Portuguese sailing around Africa. So Henry the Navigator, who was the younger brother of the King of Portugal, who started a whole bunch of explorations around the coast of Africa, was actually achieving globalization because he was moving his culture into other continents and bringing back their culture to his. So this proto-globalization was like this whole, from 1600 to about 1800, if you were an empire that wanted any kind of influence in the world, you had to start sending ships out. And China was doing it too during this time. If you'll remember, the dynasty that was in China at this time was building ships and sending them out. And so we've got all of this movement all over the globe there where people are, sharing their knowledge, sharing their people, sharing their products, and sharing their money, and moving it into these other societies. Let's talk for a minute about what that looks like, practically speaking, though. Can you just walk into another country with products safely and trade them and then walk back out with your skin intact? What do you have to do in order to be a country that introduces your culture into another country?
You like going to custom?
Or whatever.
I need to go to the government.
Yeah, ideally you would go through the government, but in a lot of cases they didn't. The East India Company landed on the Indian shores and built their own government, and then forced the government of India to interact with them.
Oh, no,
Yeah, colonization to a degree. You have to, and what do you need in order to have a colony? I mean, right? And those people are all, yeah, like-minded, civilized, completely soft, gentle souls who appear on your coastline and just want to share love and joy with you.
Are we talking about armies?
Yeah, you have to have military. You have to, if you want to move into a globalization, if you want to become a colonizing force, you have to have arms and ammunition with you. You have to have weaponry with you.
Sure.
You have to, every overture of peace is backed by the strength of arms behind it. So, yeah, right, because, you know, and okay, my husband and I have been binge watching Stargate SG-1 for like so long now that it's really hard for me not to see the parallels. But the Stargate science fiction show, for those of you all who don't know, is about a group of soldiers. Well, some of them are civilians. Daniel is a scientist and Teal'c is an alien soldier, but they're still soldiers. They're all militarily trained, who go in and they walk through the Stargate onto a new planet, and then they introduce themselves as peaceful explorers, but they're holding right in their front this massive automatic weapon. And I always look at them and I'm like, how do you expect people to think that you're actually a peaceful person? Hi, we come in peace, you know, pretty much every time. And I'm like, that's this in a nutshell, this proto-globalization. That's this in a nutshell. We have come in peace to trade our products with you, and if you don't want our products, then we're going to make you trade us with them anyway. And we bring soldiers to make sure that that happens, and also missionaries, so that we all speak the same faith language. It's a whole 200 years of that. Well, history. So in 1815, a lot of these cultures were already very interconnected because of that proto-globalization period, and they went to war with each other. And one of the ways that this was expressed is in the Napoleonic Wars, which we studied a little bit. In 1815, when the Napoleonic Wars ended, there was a season of peace in Europe on the governmental level, although there were a lot of popular uprisings that followed that. The governments were actually trying to negotiate alliances and peace with each other. There were also several revolutions in technology that made the world more closely connected. That was a revolution in transportation, because there was the advent of the steam engine, which made it possible for trains to move without horses. That made crossing the country easier, so it made crossing the continent of Europe easier. Railroads also got built in other places. I think, I guess it was probably Sam that was writing about the railroads that were crossing Canada, is that right? And railroads were being built in Asia too. So we have steamships, which travel upriver and not just downriver, which is cool. They can travel against the current. So we have a whole interconnected system. And we also have the advent of better forms of communication. So somewhere during the middle of the 1800s, I think it's 1830s, Samuel Morse introduces the idea of the telegraph. He doesn't invent the telegraph. He borrows the invention of the telegraph and makes it so that it can cross oceans. It's important that we know the difference.
Hey, Mindy, Sam Bolt played a little part in that, the telegraph.
Yeah, there was a whole system of the machine with all the wires that pointed at the letters and all that kind of stuff. So there was that kind of thing. But the idea of being able to communicate across water without just hand carrying a letter on a ship across the water made a huge difference. And the connectivity of the world resulted in people moving faster, which meant products moved faster, and forced opening of markets. This is the age of, from 1850 to this is the age of the new British Empire and settlements in Africa by the Belgians and all this kind of stuff. And there's also a different kind of person that's carrying all this out, because there's been this wave of something called liberalization, which is not to be confused with liberal, like we think of the word liberal today in American politics today. Liberalization means the more and more people think that individuals have worth, and therefore that individuals have their own destinies. It all ties up with romanticism and stuff. So the people that are carrying out these trades are themselves seeking their own fortunes and seeking their own destinies. So we have modern globalization kind of starts during the Napoleonic Wars and kind of carries to the present day. We have been on a path where we have closer and closer connected our countries to each other, where we have tried to tie more of the world together, and we've never really backed off of that, even though we've had some wars. The end result of those wars was actually closer connections, because more technology was invented during those wars, which made it easier to communicate. The use of the radio as a communication device was a wartime technological advance that then became, you know, something that civilians used. So we've been on that arc ever since 1815. I'm just going to point out that in 1956, something revolutionary happened to the world, and that was the invention of the shipping container. Which the invention of the shipping container made it so that products could be moved in great big stacks across large bodies of water all at once, which ran perfectly and without flaw until this year, when the Suez Canal got blocked. Every other time it's been perfect.
I mean, they're just finding people
Yeah, there's that's me being fissy. I obviously don't mean that, but the invention of the shipping container made it so that a larger number of products could be shipped across the ocean at once, and manufacturing as a result, you know, is carried across the ocean. I just mentioned in passing that happened in 1956. Okay, in the wake of all this, globalism is always for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In the wake of all this, globalism is also protectionism. Protectionism is the idea that whatever other policies you enact, your country should be the one that is benefiting from them. And there was a wave of protectionist ideas in the beginning of the 1900s. There was wave after wave of tariffs. A tariff has a job to do. It's supposed to do this. These are what tariffs are supposed to do, but they're all based on mercantilist theory. So a tariff is supposed to raise money for the government that imposes it, okay? So a tariff is money that you have to pay on products that you buy from other countries, okay? So it's supposed to generate money for your government. Those taxes that you pay by buying your clothes from France instead of buying them from Pennsylvania are supposed to pay money into the government, which is supposed to raise money for the US government. It's supposed to make it so that you're more inclined to buy things that are made locally than things that are imported. And it is supposed to create an attitude of reciprocity. So if I impose a tariff on clothes from France and France imposes a tariff on wine from America, maybe we can leverage those two things against each other, and we can both agree to back our tariffs off, and we can use them as negotiating tools. That's what tariffs are supposed to do.
Or we get the whole buy American made.
Yeah, buy American, because it's good for your country. If you buy American, it's important. Yeah, but American companies often use labor in other countries, so for American made products, so it's tricky. The problem with tariffs is that a lot of times they end up harming the people that they're supposed to protect. When a tariff is imposed on a domestic product, a lot of times the producers of that domestic product are actually harmed by it. If you have to pay more money for clothes from France than you pay for money for clothes from Pennsylvania, a lot of times people will just pay it, or you'll just buy cheaper clothes from China. You know, chances are you're putting a tariff on clothes from France is not going to help the clothing industry in Pennsylvania. So, because they just almost never work the way, they're very unpredictable. The way consumers, shoppers are very unpredictable people. It's hard to control them. So they often don't work. And as a result, you end up with animosity between countries. This is a quote by somebody who was, this is a quote, I think he said it in 1928, which means it would have been between World War I and World War II, where he said, when goods cannot cross borders, armies will. And he was talking, he was French, and he was talking about a brewing situation because of very harsh tariffs that America had imposed on European countries in order to bolster the American economy, which didn't really work because America ended up in a Great Depression anyway. So when goods cannot cross borders, armies will. So to prevent that from happening again, So if you remember, between World War I and World War II, there was a massive wave of economic disasters that happened. The biggest one being obviously in Germany, where hyperinflation was an issue. In order to prevent that from happening before World War II was even over, 44 countries gathered in New Hampshire to talk about how to make sure that didn't happen after the war was over. So one of the ways that the US got involved in World War II was trying to help plan the post-war party, basically, trying to help plan the events that were going to happen after the war was over. So this is in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 700 people representing 44 allied countries got together, and that included the USSR, who were, allies to the US at that time. And they established a couple of institutions specifically for the purpose of making sure that tariffs did not become so punitive, so damaging, that countries were not able to recover from them, to establish a way in which reparations could be paid by the losers of the country. One of the countries in attendance was West Germany, was Germany, but diplomats who were German diplomats were attending, because Germany was still fighting a war against the Allies. But one of the people that was involved in the conversation were people from Germany. So the idea was to they established the International Monetary Fund, which was a place where countries could pay in and then use that money sort of nationally to prevent there from being another economic disaster. That's the IMF. And they also established the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now, if you remember, right after the war, one of the things that America did was pour money into the Allied countries so that they could rebuild. America, who didn't have anything to rebuild because they had never gotten bombed themselves, except for Pearl Harbor, basically. They were able to pour funds into reconstruction and development, but it was using a bank model, which means it's like using a loan, as opposed to just pouring money in and never seeing it again. There was always going to be interest on these loans that was going to come back. So they established that the International Monetary Fund, the IBRD, and then they also wrote the Final Act, which was actually in capital letters, the Final Act, which basically established that all of the currency of all of these countries coming out of World War II would be pegged to gold, would be connected to their store of gold, so that there would be a common denominator between all these currencies, and that it would all be convertible. Now, have any of y'all done any international travel? Yeah, when you go from one country to another, you have to change your money from the US dollars to something else usually.
Yeah, US dollars doesn't work.
Well, you have to do that because the local economy probably doesn't accept dollars. But the reason that you are able to convert money from dollars to francs, or from dollars to euros, or from dollars to British pounds is because of this agreement, because they agreed to make it so that somebody somewhere would maintain an idea of how to convert one thing to another, and you would be allowed to do that. There are still countries where you can't. You can't convert to rubles, for example. I don't know if you know this, but Russian. Yeah, they don't have a convertibility agreement, so it's very hard. You can only do it on the black market. You can only convert dollars to rubles on the black market. So one of the things that they did. So let's think back to that time in the Mediterranean, like archaic globalization. Why does it matter that money is convertible? Why does it matter?
So you can buy products from everybody.
Right, because that way it's easy, you can negotiate the price of a product across a wide number of nations. That's kind of step one. The Phoenicians did it and changed the economy of the entire Mediterranean by bringing all money under a single heading, by bringing all language under a single heading. So this conference led to the establishment of a series of general agreements on tariffs and trade, and they're called GATTs. And if you are interested in finding out more about this, you can, but basically let me explain what happens. This is a group of people that represents many, many countries who gets together and examines all of the tariffs that those countries have in action right now. And they have what are called rounds. I really want to pull it up because I just think it's funny looking, but I don't know if I'm going to. And the rounds it starts off in the 1940s and 1950s, where the rounds are like months long. and then they're like 8 months long, and then 17 months long, and then 38 months long. Okay, the current round of this association that examines all the tariffs has been in action since 1981. Okay, they have never stopped. They've just never broken up and gone, okay, that's everything. We've covered everything. We can stop now. They haven't stopped because they just, tariffs are coming and going all the time. And this organization's job is to look at that. What they did do is in 1993, they established an organization responsible for that. And that's called the World Trade Organization. So the GATT got together over and over again, and the GATT examined all of the tariffs that people were imposing and made sure they were fair and reasonable and able to, you know, that they were not beggar your neighbor agreements. Beggar your neighbor, that means forming a tariff specifically to cripple one of your neighbors.
Isn't this one of the organizations that Trump was trying to get out of?
Oh yeah, he hates the World Trade Organization. He hated it because they exist to tell America what to do. I mean, they exist to tell all the countries involved what to do. They tell you if you could make money by imposing a tariff on China, but doing so would be harmful to China, the World Trade Organization will tell you that and expects you to kind of listen, because if another country was doing that to America, specifically to harm America, they tell them that too. That's the idea of it. But at this point, the World Trade Organization is the product of an organization that could literally spend 7 years arguing about something and not come to an agreement. So the World Trade Organization is top heavy, very messy, and they only have the power that's given to them. So literally a country can say, you know, the World Trade Organization can condemn a tariff and say that's bad, that's a beggar your neighbor tariff, that's an unhealthy tariff, that's going to cause problems, and that country can go, yeah, we're going to do it anyway. So how much power they have is it's a little wishy-washy how much power they have, but they exist specifically to negotiate trade agreements so that, you know, both countries can come out on top, because you often need a third party. Okay, there's a lot of information here. You don't need all of it because I'm not going to test you on which dates people came into this, but the reason why these cooperative efforts exist has a lot to do with post-World War II attitudes and that speech that you had to read by Winston Churchill. The only way that we're going to combat this is through European unity. In 1949, he helped to form the Council of Europe, which was supposed to be a cure for rampant nationalism. The idea was it was rampant nationalism that caused World War I. And it was continuing nationalism that fed into World War II. It was German nationalism that kicked off World War II. What can we do to make sure that nationalism is not the driving force? Let's establish a European community, a community of Europeans working together that, yes, value their own country, but also value their participation in a community as a whole. It starts off with taking the money from the Marshall Plan and the coal and steel industry and using this alliance between Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and West Germany to plan how that money and how that influx into the industry was going to be used so that it could be beneficial to everybody. So that was the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC. At the same time, the European Economic Community came together, and it's the same countries that formed the European Economic Community, and the European Atomic Community came together, because once America started dealing with atomic bombs, Europe had to start dealing with atomic bombs, and especially since American forces were actually moving into and occupying those European countries with atomic bombs possibly pointed at their enemies on the other side of the Ural Mountains. The European countries need to form an alliance specifically for them. So they took all three of those, the ECSC, the EEC, and Euratom, and put them together into what was called the European Community, which will eventually be called the European Union. That's a broad overview of that, and it skips a lot of steps, but that's the basic idea you have to get. It starts off with those Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and West Germany. In 1973, Denmark, Ireland, and grudgingly the UK finally joined. Hi, Deborah. The UK finally joined, And then in 1981, Greece kind of fell apart and put itself back together and joined the EU. Portugal and Spain in 1986. In 1993, they began calling themselves the European Union. And in 1996, when the wall came down and Germany was reunited as a single country, East Germany was folded into the European Union as part of a new whole, not East or West, but just Germany. And in 2002, they began to talk about having a common currency, the euro.
Yeah.
Why would they want a common currency? We just talked about this like 5 minutes ago.
So they don't have to go through the exchanges.
Right, that way they can neutralize the power of exchange. Everybody uses the euro, and the euro is useful for everything. Why would you not want to change your country's currency for the euro? Any reason why you'd want to hold on to something and not switch over to the euro?
It's your value.
Yeah, it's possible that you'd lose something in the exchange. And Britain was worried about that in the beginning. They were worried the pound was worth more than the euro. So if they all switch to euros, do they just lose all that money? What happens? You know, there's that. Is there any other reason why you wouldn't want to change for the euro?
Sometimes you can barter with your own country's money.
Yeah, sometimes. Let's just think about it from our own perspective. If somebody told us today, we're going to stop using dollars, we're all going to use euros. What would your knee jerk
That's to
reaction be?
relearn money.
How much a euro is worth?
It was foreign, it's confusing, it's different, it's a whole different system we'd have to learn, and our whole like mythology is built around the dollar. That's part of our identity. Right, so Winston Churchill, who called for an end to rampant nationalism and a European Union and European unity, it was
time to do that.
yeah, it was the legacy after that. It was the UK after that was like, yeah, I don't think we're going to go for the euro. We're going to keep the pounds, which is a shame because I don't understand how pounds work. I got to be honest. I'm like, what the heck is a shilling? I have no idea. Anyway, so what did happen as a result of this is the European Union, 10 more countries joined. So they're not listed here, but all these countries joined. The ones that had left the USSR joined the European Union and began trading with the euro, using the euro. So the euro actually gained power as a result of that.
I wonder how that works for Greece. They're bankrupt now.
Yeah. Oh, Greece is a mess. Okay. So this is all of everything that we just covered was about economic globalization. It has to come first. Economic globalization has to come first. Do I have that here? Yeah. Economic culturalization, globalization has to come first. Money moves before anything else does. There has to be a reason to trade, and there has to be a way to trade. So there has to be products that you want or products that you want to sell, and there has to be a currency that you and the other countries agree on before anything else can happen. But once that does happen, once you open up trade and once you connect through trade and once you connect to currency, the next thing to pour in is culture. Okay, because as soon as you open a dialogue and you're both speaking a common language, you begin to exchange ideas. Okay, so the second thing to happen is cultural globalization. One of the big ways in the 20th century that cultural globalization happened, that cultures were shared, is through massive sporting events. Sports ball for the win. The Olympic Games are a place where cultures are actually legitimately exchanged. Doors are open and windows are opened into cultures that would not otherwise be.
So apparently it's part of a sex too between countries.
Yeah, I've heard that too, that there's a lot of hooking up going on at the Olympics. I don't really like to think about it that much, but like, I'm glad they're having fun. You know, I'm so happy, you're so happy. But the biggest thing is that, you know, like for example, I think it was 2004, maybe 2008, I don't really remember. There was a Chinese gymnastics team, and a lot of people was it Chinese? I think it was Chinese. Yeah, and they were doing very, very well, but nobody who looked at them believed that these girls were 16.
Yeah, they have an age thing.
Yeah, there was a lot of controversy because the Western countries looked at these girls and thought these girls are not 16. You have to be 16 to compete in the Olympics, and these girls look like they're 10 or 12. Well, enough documentation came out to prove that they were actually 16 years old, but what that revealed was American and Western culture has a very different idea of what a 16-year-old looks like than Eastern and Chinese culture. And that's one of the ways that cultural globalization has an effect, is that a 16-year-old in an American movie is usually played by a 28-year-old. And so you look at a 16-year-old and you go, that's what they look like. But actually, there are a lot of 16-year-olds who are just barely beginning their development. And that's not something that Hollywood makes public very much. They don't have a lot of 16-year-olds who still, look like children, who still look young, because they're almost always played by older actors. And so across the board, people were reacting to this gymnastics team like, these are children, these are not teenagers. But they actually were teenagers, but Americans have a funky idea of what teenagers look like. And American culture has permeated so much of European culture that a lot of Europe was like, are these actual 16-year-olds? That was one of the ways that happened. When the Olympic Games are held someplace that's not quite ready for them, you end up with events like when the Olympic Games were in Russia.
And you get wolves up the door?
Yeah, there are like plumbing problems and wolves, and you realize that the economies in these countries are very different from each other, and what they prioritize is very different. So one of the good things about the Olympic Games is that it brings together so many different kinds of countries to explore each other's cultures. The same thing is true of the FIFA World Cup.
With the Rio?
Yeah, which America is not so big on participating in. We have a presence there, but we're very rarely a ranked presence because it's soccer and we have football. So we have our own game that we play. We have the World Series, which is baseball, which is just us against us, basically.
Well, Japan is giving up.
Yeah, Japan is climbing, but it took them for a long time. The World Series was about American teams facing American teams. The World Cup, on the other hand, the World Cup is so many different countries on so many different continents all participating in this sporting event that it's a lot of cross-cultural. What America mostly contributes to cultural globalization is product, but that actually happens in reverse too, because that's how Japan became an imperialist nation right after World War II, was through the cultural globalization of products. They figured out what Americans wanted and they made it, and they made it and they provided it cheaply, and that's what happened. That's why we have so many Japanese electronics in our homes, is because of this attempt at pushing a product across cultural lines, across global lines. Global travel and immigration, the movement of people, is the other way that this happens. And travel, the transportation revolutions made travel more possible and more made people capable of traveling greater distances. It started with trains and steamships and ended up with planes that fly all the time, basically. But we're not just talking about people visiting other countries, we're talking about, movement. These are statistics for how many people immigrated from one country to another in various years. I think the most recent one I have is 2015, and it's, over 240 million people that moved in the year of 2015. Some of them because they were refugees, and some of them because they just moved. They were just people that were moving from one country to another. So the idea that you can move from one country to another and take up residence someplace else. Oh yeah, I feel you, Megan, I'm sorry. The Quidditch World Cup, yeah. But I mean, and okay, the Quidditch World Cup is a good example of that though, because teams from all over the world got together. But that wasn't the event at which Cedric Diggory died, so. That was the Triwizard Tournament. But anyway.
We also need World Cups to beat on each other, because Russia gets in trouble a lot.
Well, and think about the effect of taking out your aggression on another country at the World Cup instead of taking it out on, say, a battlefield someplace. Like this was always, I always thought this was a good idea. I wish it worked better. Like, I wish when there were massive disagreements and treaties and stuff, we could be like, we'll see you at the Olympics, and that will be how that's settled. My guy got the gold medal, so we win the treaty, but that would be gladiatorial. We don't want to do that. So anyway, the number of people who just move from one country to another increases every year. It's growing every year. Within countries, immigration is also growing. So like in the United States, we have people moving from one state to another in greater and greater numbers, although this year there's been kind of a hitch. So I'll bet the 2020 numbers are going to be lower by a significant amount. But up until 2020, up until COVID, there were, like, for instance, mass immigrations from California to Texas. I don't know why, but a lot of people are moving from, from California to Texas, obviously because Texas is awesome. But
California has a lot of laws.
yeah, sometimes it has to do with the economy, and sometimes it has, whatever the reason is that people move, the idea that they feel like they can is because the world is globalized. So that's what order this always goes in. First, the economy moves into an area, and then the culture moves into an area, and then politics move into that area. The politics of a local area begin to be affected by the global community. Suddenly, to your local country, even to your local city, politics that are happening in China or Russia or the UK actually affect the decisions that are being made on the local level. So the more connected the world becomes, the more these things matter. For example, policies are getting dictated in small towns in Texas that are being drawn from events that are happening in, say, Portland. That's a thing that happens within the country, but it also happens on a bigger scale, because there are countries now that are putting laws into effect as a reflection of things that are happening in America to prevent what's happening in America. So you have, like, for example, last year you have laws banning certain kinds of artwork and statues in European countries to prevent the kind of protesting that happened in America, the Black Lives Matter protesting in America. So, like, they have taken down statues of people who were famous, but who were also slave traders in Europe as a result of protests that are happening in America. So political globalization is also something that happens. So it starts with products, it starts with money, and then it becomes culture, and then it becomes politics. Okay, so last week we were talking about the bipolar world, where it's like us or them, communists or capitalists, and there's this sharp chasm, this iron curtain between them. How does globalization change the politics of the other side? So I'm going to do a little case study of that with you. We're going to talk about Michael Jordan and Nike. So a couple of things you need to know about, because y'all are all pretty young and you don't remember this, but, like, believe it or not, the idea of an African American being the poster person for a product in America was not that common until Michael Jordan came along. He was one of the first where a major product used a Black man as a spokesperson. And the reason that he was able to do that was because he himself became one of the most internationally recognized athletes in the world. He became he was on the Olympic team in 1984, the American Olympic basketball team, and he became one of the most recognized faces across the globe as a result of that. Nike capitalized on that. Nike got him to agree to have a brand named after him, the Air Jordan, named after him, and then they tried an experiment which became a pattern for other American companies after that. The only other country that had really tried it was Coca-Cola, and they were successful too, but they weren't as successful as Nike was, because Nike was using Michael Jordan. And that was to use this new satellite television, communications technology to broadcast a brand across borders into other countries. And they started by spending 10 times on their advertising what they spent on their R&D. So Nike spent 10 times on advertisement what it spent on research and development for its products. Okay, and it used that money to put their brand, and especially Michael Jordan jumping up into the air, flying, so he was like a flying super, character, as a recognizable figure across the globe. And they pushed it into Europe, and then they managed to use satellite technology, satellite broadcast TV, to push it into Asia and into Japan. Japan picked it up really fast, and Nike shoes and Coca-Cola became the two American products that Japanese people wanted the most. That was something that became so popular, the idea
It's
of,
like KFC.
Hmm?
It's like the KFC. KFC.
They do now, but that's an advertising pattern that follows this. Now we know how to get American products out. And in France at the time, what happened was the idea of Nike becoming a thing that if you could get it in your country, if you were the one that had the Nike shoes, then you were somehow connected to this superhero character of Michael Jordan. Then you know, it was worth whatever money you had to pay to do that, because that made you like incredibly special.
Like the American Gucci and Uggs and all that stuff.
Right, yeah. And once Nike figured out how to do that, making an American product the thing to have became something that was, you know, possible for other companies that followed. But it started with Michael Jordan. And one of the ways that it happened is that they sent him on tours to promote the product. I mean, he went on Goodwill tours, but he wore his Nike shoes when he did. I mean, and everybody recognized him from the, you know, commercial. I can't do Michael Jordan, and it's a good thing for y'all that I can't, but the thing that he did where he jumped really high and his legs went apart and he was flying, that became something Japanese kids thought was really popular. And there's just enough connectivity between Japan and communist China, just enough connectivity that when it flooded into the market in Japan, it seeped into the market in China. And suddenly, the idea of a product being something to covet in a communist country became a way to open the door for American culture to make it into China. Okay, so it starts with a product, and it starts with trade agreements, and it starts with money. But as soon as you get your foot in the door and start prying it open, American culture, and where American culture hit was Hong Kong.
And they're getting really big in basketball right now.
Right, but it started Michael Jordan actually making trips to Hong Kong. And as a result of those trips and as a result of that publicity, which Nike poured money into that. I mean, like they spent and spent and spent and spent and spent to make that happen. They've gotten it all back, they're fine. But it was worth every dime that they spent. But as a result of him as a goodwill ambassador, as a person who was an internationally recognized good guy that everybody liked, and you know, sort of super, you know, living on Earth, able of superhuman things, you know, whatever, the mythos that got surrounded around him. As a result of that, doors were pried open that allowed for other comments and other conversations about American culture in strictly controlled re-education camp China. Okay, so the effect of globalization. There was a French person at the time, I can't remember what his name was, but who saw it happening as it started to unravel, as Nike started to gain ground, and warned the rest of the world that American culture only goes one way. Okay, so American culture goes out, it doesn't come in. When American culture permeates, it doesn't pick up local culture and bring it back to America. American culture goes out, it doesn't come back in. So, and his argument was, if American culture begins to get a foothold in Europe, it will displace all of the things that are European, and American culture will begin to fill every crevice in every other country, and our culture will not make it back to them, which means that, you know, over time, other cultures will die. You know, other cultural offerings will disappear. Do you think that's true?
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
No.
Hmm?
We have bidets here.
Yeah, okay, all right.
But we've also lost all your traditional home growth. You said bidet, but I thought you said beignets, and I got upset. I mean, we have that too.
Do you think it's true that American culture only goes one direction?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a tricky for me because I don't know what American culture is. That's part of the reason why American culture only goes one direction, is because we don't have American. There's nothing that's American. Like there's Native American, which, by the way, is big in some European countries. I have this aunt, and I think she's absolutely cuckoo. But she's German. She's West German. She's, you know, she was born in West Germany, and she married my uncle, who was American GI, and he became a German citizen, and they still live there. And she, you know, how some people, do you all have friends who participate in like Renaissance reenactment groups and stuff? They have Native American reenactment groups in Germany. They love them. They have full, like they put lots of money into their outfits. So you have these really pasty pale people that are out there in their full Native American gear doing dances and trading crafts and having fairs and, you know, staging demonstrations and showing everybody houses. And they talk about American culture as the thing that killed the thing they love. Okay, so
They're not
like,
wrong.
they're not, I mean, I'm glad they're so enthusiastic about it. We might not do that. I mean, if we were gonna have a Native American reenactment society, that would be almost appropriation, because it'd be a bunch of pasty white people pretending to be Native Americans, which would be insensitive to the fact that probably, 10 miles down the road are actual Native Americans who could do it. So in Germany, they do that. We have medieval recreation societies here. We recreate Europe, they recreate America, but it did move in that direction. It didn't move the other way. We have like Fredericksburg and Oktoberfest, but we've heavily Americanized those things.
Heavily Americanized Cinco de Mayo.
Cinco de Mayo is a great example of this. Cinco de Mayo is not something that gets celebrated in Mexico the way it gets celebrated in America. Most Americans could not tell you what Cinco de Mayo is about. So when we say culture only moves one way, that's, you point to certain things to go, but I ate 5 different cultures' food this week.
I think what they need is an American state culture, and then they pretty much, we don't integrate it, we just take it over.
Well, let me just put it this way. If you buy a pizza in Italy,
It's not. Gonna
it's
be
probably an American pizza. Because Italians don't make pizza the way Americans do. They don't, pizza is a trash food.
Yeah.
It's a thing you do with leftovers in Italy. You don't make pizza. So if you are someplace where you can order a pizza in Italy, it's probably from Domino's. It's probably an American company. The same thing is true of a lot of the foods, Taco Bell, things like that. So when they say American culture only goes one way, that's probably what they mean. Wow, we are out of time. I didn't even realize. Probably my favorite example of this is Euro Disney, which sells French pastry, except it's American-made, shipped-in pastry, even though Euro Disney is actually in France. Probably my favorite example of that is that if you go to Euro Disney and you order a French pastry, it was made in an American company to American standards and shipped there in a freezer.
Mindy,
Yes.
FYI, Michael Jordan net worth, well, he's worth 1.6 billion. His annual intake on those Nikes is 130 million.
Every cent of it deserved, I'm sure. Like I don't resent him a single penny of that, because he turns around and gives back to his community, but also because his advertising campaign that they used him for actually started to erode the power of communism in a lot of countries. Like, people don't realize how much of that his ad campaigns are responsible for. All right, well, it's 9:15. I didn't realize we were so, okay, so let me just tell you real quick that you do have a little bit of a reading thing.